So we're doing bohmcast number 3, but this is really the one that I'm the most excited about. For the viewers, Ron has been part of my life personally and professionally for 2 decades. And, the way that I got into this business was pretty funny, because who would have thought that a contractor from the building side would be getting involved with a retail operation that has been in existence in El Cerrito for 45 years, and get it from the individual that has a significant tie and thread to Abbey, to the Abbey brand. So I said this in the very beginning, that I was honored to take on carry the torch, if you will, of this store. I think it's going to be pretty obvious to the listeners that nobody makes it in business 45 years without doing a lot of stuff right. Ron has done that, obviously. And I don't want to be the one to mess it up. So that was kind of the way I looked at it when I came in. So Ron Codron's with us today. This is the podcast, or the interview, that I was the most excited about doing, because I wanted to let the listeners hear from Ron himself, a guy that's been in the industry, I would say probably your whole professional career. Tell us a little bit about you, Ron, how you got here, and tell us about that Abbey story. Especially, don't let them miss out on the fact of your dad's connection, your connection. Ron Codron, go ahead. I'm gonna stop talking, because it's
Well, thank you, Kevin. I've been looking forward to this as well. As you say, 45 years, and you've known me for what, 20, and it's too bad you missed out on those other 2.5 decades. They were fun when I was new to the game. So this would have to go back, my goodness. I have to take this back to college in a way, in order to prep you for what came later. So I went to Auburn University in Alabama, because my dad was a career pilot in the Air Force. My whole family, as a matter of fact, we've been Air Force. My brother, a career B-52 pilot. And myself, in college, I thought I would be a pilot as well and make a career out of it. But the closer I got to completing my education there, I was questioning whether I wanted to do that, or, since I'd lived it as a military brat all of my young life, I thought maybe I'd like to try something different. I was in ROTC at Auburn, and so naturally got a commission into the Air Force, and this was during Vietnam, so the Air Force was a good place to be if you had to be in one of the services rather than the Army. And I went into the Air Force, again, with an open mind, thinking I'd be a pilot, but they were offering Masters in Business Administration. They would pay for it through the Air Force Institute of Technology. And I decided to take advantage of it. The only problem with that is you couldn't be a pilot and do that. Well, I became a missile launch control officer. That's something that is, you're trained. You have to go through security clearances that you can't believe, because you have what they call top secret crypto clearance, which very few people have. It's the top. And so they called relatives, called friends, made sure that I was a good risk. And I go into the Air Force knowing that I'm going to get my MBA, which was exciting. Just a note on what I did as a missile launch control officer. This is in Montana, and it's a Minuteman system, ICBM. And they literally fly you, or chopper you, actually, out from the base, which was Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. And they chopper you out, The nearest ones, the nearest silos were, say, 50 miles away, and the furthest were probably 150 miles away. And so you're choppered out there, and you see this this nondescript area that you land on the pod, and then you go in, and you're greeted by security clearance, NCOs and PSATs, which were your primary strategic alert teams. They carried machine guns, obviously because the Russians were our enemies, and we're in the middle of the Cold War and Vietnam, in case they had an idea that they wanted to attack one of our silos. And my silo was one of about 50. And each silo has control over 10 ICBM Minuteman systems, any one of which can do pretty severe damage to whatever country that you're targeting. And of course, in those days, it was obvious who we were targeting. At any rate, so then you go down into this elevator after you're authenticated and past security. Me and my deputy. I was a captain, and my deputy was a second or first lieutenant. And we go down 80 to 100 feet, and you're greeted by a multi-ton blast door. And then after you authenticate again, because there are all kinds of fail-safe mechanisms to make sure that nothing bad happens and no missiles launch when they shouldn't be, and they open the blast door, and you walk in and you do what they call a changeover. You check the circuit breakers, you check, all the different kinds of systems, communication systems, high frequency, UHF, very low frequency, klaxons, buzzers, bells were going off constantly, the motor generator, which is why I am now wearing hearing aids, because they actually will destroy a certain decibel level after years of being down there. So that's basically what it was. We had, chefs upstairs. They would do the cooking and send it down in the elevator, just all kinds of things. In the beginning, you had to be down there 24 hours straight, ostensibly without sleep. It was pretty rough, but then later they changed it to where you'd be up 8 hours, down each 8 hours, up to sleep 8 hours, down, and then chopper back. Anyhow, that was my career, my short career. It went for 5.5 years. Ordinarily, it would have been 4, but I had to pay Air Force back 1.5 years for the MBA that I received. All right. Now, when I get out of the Air Force 5.5 years later, my dad has now retired. My father was an elite bridge player. For those who are listening and know bridge, all I have to say was that he was on the perennial McKinney list, way, way, way above Life Master. And by osmosis, I was a bridge player too, just because I grew up in that environment. At any rate, my father, being an elite bridge player, retired from the Air Force. And after having flown 24 different planes, many of which were test in his 23-year career, and he survived it, not having a street named after him, which, when you auger in,
Most people.
after flying 24 test airplanes, you usually don't make it out the other side. So I'm proud to say my dad survived all of that and didn't have a street named after him. He retired, came to Sacramento, and that's where Mather and McClellan Air Force Base was, so that way he could, and my mom could have the commissary BX and medical privileges. At any rate, so he's now there. I'm getting out of the Air Force. I had no idea what to do with my MBA. I thought I'd be working for IBM or something. And my dad, who's an elite bridge player, meets, and here we come for full circle, Milt Levison, who was the genius that gave birth to Abbey Carpet back then. Now it's called Abbey Carpet and Floor, of course. But back then it was called Abbey Carpet. He gave birth to it. He used to sell door to door, scraps of remnants that he had that he would take door to door to sell, and then work that into one store on Franklin Boulevard in Sacramento. There, he actually created 2 other stores, one in Carmichael and another place in Sacramento, and then one in Citrus Heights. Well, so there were several in Sacramento. And then he began to franchise them. Well, Milt Levison had a passion more for bridge than for floor covering, if you can imagine it. And he loved floor covering. The problem was he was a miserable bridge player. He was horrible. I mean, I know, I played with him. And my father, who was like the king of the mountain then, everybody wanted to play with him, including Milt. And Milt Levison went up to my father and he said, Jim, I want to play bridge with you. Can I play bridge with you? And my dad said, sure. He said, yeah, but I want you to make me a life master, he said to my father. And my father knew what kind of bridge player Milt was, and I don't know, he was probably choking about then, and said, this would be a challenge. He took it on. He made Milt a life master by being his partner, and taught him how to play a little bit better as well, all at the same time. In the meantime, Milt wants to thank my father. How does he do that? He makes him his vice president.
Because that makes perfect sense, right?
Doesn't that make perfect sense?
From the career military guy going into the floor
covering business. Right. And my dad tried it for about, I don't know, 3 or 6 months, something like that, and realized that he didn't want to be anybody's vice president. He wanted to play bridge in his retirement. And told Milt that. And then Milt said, well, you know what, Jim? Look, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you a store. I'm going to give you the Citrus Heights store, the Abbey carpet store in Citrus Heights, because you don't have to work it. You just get someone to work it for you. Get a salesman. It's easy. Right, it's easy. As I said, now I am getting out of the Air Force. My dad and I are talking, and he said, son,
here you go.
Ronnie, I want you to come back here, and I want you to run my store. Run your store? I said, Dad, doesn't that include selling? He said, why, sure. And I said, well, Dad, I couldn't possibly do that. That's beneath me. I'm an officer and a gentleman. And my dad said, yes, by act of Congress. And so I say, Dad, really, I don't think I want to do that. I had these visions of working for, an IBM or something like
MBA
that.
And
big
you're a captain
corporate,
in the Air Force.
yeah.
And I'm not.
And so my dad says, son, but this is perfect for you. You have an MBA, and you will be managing this store. You'll be the manager. Well, he talked me into it. I adored my father. He didn't have to work hard to talk me into anything. And there I wound up in Citrus Heights for the better part of a year. And I managed the place. I cleaned the latrine. I vacuumed the floor. I did everything that you can think of, including sales and handling the crews, the installation crews, which wasn't easy. But in terms of coming around, I got to tell you, I fell in love with it. I realized what real life was all about. I met people, real people, who I just really enjoyed meeting, and I think they enjoyed meeting too. And I think that's probably the foundation of my future success. I did not, Kevin, need an MBA to do what I did. I didn't need it at all. All it took was common sense, and following up with people, being honorable, with them, and just to interject this other thing, and that is, when I sold my business here almost 2 years ago, I had the luxury of more than one person wanting to buy this business. And I can say that I picked the right guy. I picked you because I see you were made, I like to think, in the same mold that I was. Honorable and always following up and doing the right thing. So I have to say, I feel like I've passed the baton and you've taken it and carried it to a whole nother level. You've poured your heart and your soul into my store. You've remodeled it from top to bottom. And I just couldn't be prouder of what you've done with this, with my legacy. And therein lies basically the first chapter.
So that's, and I think that was, I didn't say hardly anything during what you were telling us, your story, because what a powerful story it is, and the really good stuff is learning how we got to where we are today. And so I appreciate you opening up on that, because I think it's a story that a lot of people who are going to hear this, that are in the community, are going to be, I think, impressed like I am, that, wow, that's really the story behind this store that's been here for so long, So I think it's great. I appreciate you sharing that. Keep going, yeah.
I'll just add one last thing. So I'm there with my father in Citrus Heights for a year. And Milt Levison, of course, I'm, interacting with him throughout the whole time. And he said, we have a store in El Cerrito, and it's available. Would you like it? And, I don't remember just hopping at it at that moment. I wanted to come to take a look at it and everything. I had no idea where El Cerrito was. That's the other thing. And someone had to tell me it's near San Francisco in the Bay Area. And then I realized when I came down here to look that it was actually near Berkeley too, which I really liked, that whole idea of being near a university. And what a university. Cal, I mean, come on. And so, yeah, I walked in, and here was the store. And the store, by the way, had started, just for historical clarification, the store was first at the El Cerrito Plaza.
It was not in this location,
It
which
was-
I just learned a couple of weeks ago from you.
And yes, and now it was here when I came to look at it, okay?
But
Because-
the Abbey brand, the store, has been in El Cerrito probably closer to 50 years, right?
Beyond. So it's been a little beyond 50 years, right? And then it's funny because when I came here to the store, I came to the address and I saw there was a grocery store next door, and I was thirsty. I decided to go get a Diet Coke or something. And I walked in there, and I was young back in those days, and I was wearing one of those T-shirts, and the lady that owned the place came up to me and said, "Oh, we need a warehouseman. Would you like to be our warehouseman?" I said, I said, "I'll keep that in mind. We'll see how this other thing works out."
You'll be close by just in case.
And they became my friends for decades, the people that owned the grocery store over there. At any rate, so now that sort of completes it. I accepted, and Milt made me a great offer on the store, and it's just been wonderful ever since. I've really enjoyed it.
So tell us a little bit about Phil Gutierrez and how you interacted with him.
Okay, so Phil Gutierrez is the present CEO and has been for decades. Milt Levison decided that he wanted to retire after God knows how many years he was in the business. He had probably under his wing by that time, I don't know, you might even know this, I'm trying to figure out how many franchises he had then, Kevin. Maybe 40, do you think? Or
Phil did or Milt did?
no, Milt.
Milt.
We'll go back to Milt.
I don't know the number what they had when Phil. Well, let me back up. I have heard Phil say that initially the thing that took the franchise number from 180 or 200. So I think it was a little bit below 200.
Okay. All right. So
there was a couple hundred of them under 200, I believe, when Phil really took over and then took it to another level.
Right. And when I took over this store number was 13. And there weren't many other stores then when I took it over.
And that would be in 75.
That would have been in
correct?
75,
Yeah.
August of 75 when I walked through those doors. And Phil came along. He had been working at a place called Miami Rugs in Florida. And Milt had heard great things about him and may have even met him a couple of times and said, man, I want this guy working for me. So he called Phil, made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And Phil said, I'd like to work for you. When would you want me? Well, it was Friday. He said, I want you here Monday from Florida. So he packed up his wife and 2 kids and threw everything that he could into his car and made the trek across the country. And then he became basically Milt Levison's right-hand man. He was better than Milt even thought. Milt was a genius, and so was Phil Gutierrez, and so, I should say, is he. So he took this franchise, and he didn't take it over from Milt for a while. Milt stayed on, but when he did and Phil took it over, it was like a rocket ship taking off. Phil had these grandiose ideas and he made them happen. He went from, let's say, you said 180 approximate franchises to over 800 in a relatively short amount of time.
So I had, the pleasure of having my franchise orientation, having Ron with me, and I did it in Naples, Florida, like I said, with Ron, and it was, I was given, they rolled out the red carpet for my wife and I, largely because of Ron and his relationship with Phil. And so much so that we got the royal treatment because of Ron. We had dinner with Phil and Steve Mintz and their wives.
Yes.
And then we went from dinner to his home. And all of that happened because of his relationship with Ron. So that's not lost on me, and I think that's meaningful because during that time, I asked Phil a couple of things that were fairly pointed, and he said that the tipping point that took Abbey, and I'm not gonna have the exact numbers right, but the general idea is correct, from let's say 200 stores or less to 1,200 was the fact that he switched the royalty that they would charge to the franchisee, so the independent store retailer, right? That guy, he switched it from that and put the onus or the fee, if you will, on the mills. So if you're going to sell to our buying group, we're going to get whatever the percentage was, and the onus and I'm going to even call it a handicap that the retailers had that made it hard for them, and they had that lifted from them. They went from that number to 1,200 pretty darn quick, and that was the genius part of it that you speak to about Phil. Was that switching of that.
And thank you for mentioning it, because you're absolutely right. It was draconian in the beginning when it was a certain percentage of.
And I think it was like 5%, and it doesn't really matter, but it was difficult for the retailer who, would get X amount of their bottom line back to corporate for their franchise
And
fee.
it was based on gross, Kevin,
Yep.
which is even more draconian. And yes, it was 5 or 6%, and consequently, it was very difficult, and there was a lot of murmurings and complaints. And so what Milt did after he handed the business over to Phil is now Phil was able to do it in a much easier way on the retailer, which is why they skyrocketed from 8 to 1,200 stores, because now we were able to make a living, a good living, a decent living. And it went from 6% of gross or 5% of gross to where the Mills, Mohawk, J.P. Stevens, Trend back in the day, and Shaw would pay a certain percentage, a small percentage. It was like pennies on the dollar when we went to make an order for them. So everything that was ordered, they would pay a couple of pennies, small percentage, as I said. And they were happy to do it because Abbey had 1,200 stores. Think about it. So they were able to get our business in great volume.
And it's super interesting to me that, like I said, if I'm going to go back, I had no idea the significance of the brand. And there's been a couple of things since I've been involved here that I wouldn't have learned about have it not been for getting involved. One, the whole idea about, the fact that Abbey franchised in California before McDonald's, and the fact that they have been around for so long, and in most of these communities, almost all these communities, they've been here for decades. The community recognizes it as a brand of quality and service. The other thing that I thought was fairly interesting, my son, when he graduated, finished law school, him and a couple of his friends invited my wife and I to go with them on their celebration trip to Hawaii a couple years back. And one of the girls, who was probably in her mid-20s, was from Goldendale, Washington. And she had learned that we had just closed escrow. I closed escrow June of 19, and in August is when this trip was. And we're out at dinner, and this girl in her mid-20s starts singing some Abbey jingle that I was like, what is that? And she said, you don't know the Abbey jingle? And I still don't know how to do it, but I'm sure we could find it on YouTube someplace. So the whole point of that is that the brand has been around a long time, and it's pretty cool to be part of that. I just talked with another Abbey owner today, literally right before you got in here, who's been in the Bay Area in business 86 years. I mean, they have their own flooring business. They became part of the Abbey system and have been in Abbey, I believe, for about the same amount of time that you have. Uh-huh. You probably know who they are. But the other thing that I've picked up on and been fortunate because of, we've traveled around quite a bit, and we had you and Phil introduced me to a bunch of the big reps at convention the first time before COVID-19 happened and all that. But what I've learned is that all of these stores, these owners operate very much like you do, and you did. They're proud of their business. They're supportive of their community. They want to make sure they do a good job because it's the honorable thing to do. I mean, I say it like I treat people the way I expect to be treated. And I think if you operate like that, and then Janice, when we did talked to Janice a month ago or whatever it was, she said that if it's good enough, I look at things like if it's not good enough for my house, it's not going to be okay for yours. And I think that that's a common thread throughout the Abbey system, and that's one of the reasons why I think the brand is so important and is so meaningful for us, the next generation of retailer, to continue this on, because you folks put decades in establishing that. I mean, you don't just create a brand overnight, right? not one that has this kind of legacy. And so carrying it forward, I think, is an enormous responsibility to the next generation to continue doing it, because you guys, your dad, was part of that foundation that laid that first brick at making sure that this would get to where it is today. So,
And you know, you talking about the other Bay Area stores, which you just mentioned, it's a rarity when these are friends, these are colleagues, these are not competitors. Literally, we help each other.
Yep.
And we also meet together. It's a very cohesive group, and we've been together. I should say this: we've been together for most of those 45 years on different levels. In terms of when we started, there were only 3 of us, and now there are probably 25 in the Bay Area. I mean, or the extended Bay Area, including Napa, etc. These are great people, and it's just sort of like you say, it's a family. I also have something to say about Phil Gutierrez. Let's go back in the day when he and I first met. We were basically 2 schleppers, okay? He was working for Milt, and I was working, I had just taken over this store, brand new. He wasn't brand new, but he was brand new in the Abbey system. And I was called by Cal, University of California, to go there to Berkeley to measure and to bid a job for the university. It was the ASUC building. Big, huge, large. And I was in over my head. First of all, I needed to know what commercial grade carpeting to show them. And, you know, I was nervous. This is maybe the biggest sale I've ever encountered. What Milt did was he sent Phil Gutierrez down here. Phil came down here. He closed the job for me. You know, he just helped me like you can't believe. And ever since then, we have been extremely close friends. So, you know, it happened in sort of in a humorous way. And we've been sort of locked at the hip ever since. And that's that story.
Yeah. No, that's great stuff. I don't know if I even want to, you know, I don't know what we can put the cherry on top of this now, but the store, you know, when I took over for Ron, we did a complete renovation of the store. I feel like we've brought it into the 21st century, so to speak. We changed everything. And what feels good to hear is that when you've been through the process with me here from day one, initially we talked about you having a place to hang your hat and to come because, you know, maybe this whole notion of retirement wasn't going to be, you know, you didn't want to be out altogether. And I don't know, and I've never said this before, and I'm going to say it now, I don't know if you wanted to be involved just to make sure that everything was going to be okay, and make sure that, you know, I wasn't going to mess something up here, so to speak. So we get the renovation all done and everything all moved around, and I think as you settled into, you know, your next stage of life, if you just became more comfortable or just was like, you know what, I think it's okay. You haven't really, you've brought customers in, you've sold carpet, but you really haven't, you know, been here like I thought you would be here, like we were kind of making provisions for. And I think you either one got really comfortable with it or just said, you know what, this is going to be okay, and I'm close by because I just live up the street, and if he needs me, he'll come in, and you come in a couple of times a week anyway. So can you kind of tell me, is that what was going through your mind about that transition? Because I felt like you were going to be here a little more than you ended up actually taking place, right?
Well, don't forget that I have known you for 20 years, okay? So that helped. I sort of knew, I felt like I knew what I was doing. However, yes, of course, there's always going to be those questions hanging in the back of your head. Is this going to go smoothly? Because it's very important to me. This is my legacy.
Yeah.
And it didn't take me long to learn that I could take a breath and sit back and relax, because when I saw you not just pouring your heart and soul into this store and remodeling it from top to bottom, but pouring your hard-earned money into it too. You have created the most beautiful floor covering store in the entire Bay Area, and I thought I had an attractive one. Look, it's worth mentioning that there's a magazine called Consumer Checkbook magazine out there, which a lot of your customers know about, and that they use it for advice. Well, 3 times in the last, 20 years, Consumer Checkbook has rated all of the floor covering stores in the Bay Area, every one of them. And my store back then, Abbey of El Cerrito, those 3 times, Abbey was rated the #1 store. My store was rated the #1 store, the best floor covering store in the Bay Area.
Wow.
And they only did it 3 times. And it comes not from paid sponsors. Nobody pays Consumer Checkbook for these articles. And how they voted? It was consumers who voted. Consumers who had bought from this store and consumers who had bought at other stores. And they rated this store in about 12 different categories. And we just were far and away the best. And so it's worth saying that because, yeah, I was a little nervous. I want to make sure that my 5-star average Yelp didn't go down. Think about it. There's no other store, no other floor covering store that can say they have 5 stars average. And that's where you have come in and done such an absolute wonderful job. And yeah, once I saw all of that, and it didn't take long, I could sit back and say, oh, Ron, you did the right thing. You gave this store over to Kevin.
Well, we've every time I get a 5-star Yelp review, and we had one last week, I always forward it to you, and I did. And I forget what the number was. You had a lot of them, and we've got a number, a significant number that we've added to it. So we the team, because there's no I in team. The team has done a really good job of continuing that legacy, and I'm super proud of that. And every time I get one, every time we get one, I always send it to you. So.
And I cannot tell you how much joy I have in reading them. My wife and myself. It's just like, yeah, we landed in the right place. Yeah. And one other anecdote while I'm at it. Back in the day, you were talking about the 20-year-old lady or 20-something-year-old lady singing a jingle, the Abbey jingle.
Yep.
Well, back in the day, we had, only your older customers will remember this, certainly not the millennials, but Doug McClure, Anne Francis, Howard Duff, and luminary celebrities who were great actors and actresses back in the days.